Hey guys, today we have a lot on our plate. We are talking about programming and periodization. And essentially what this boils down to is how to create training programs. Some other presentations that you may want to review or look back on to help with today's information would be testing and KPIs, progressions and regressions, sport-specific needs analysis, training frequency and exercise order, and a few charts that you may want to get reminded about or refreshed on as we work our way through this discussion today. And we'll see these slides, we'll see these charts again later on, but just keep these in mind as we're going through the discussion today. And really, each of the previous slides is going to be something that we might discuss, or something to be considering is that as we're progressing and challenging the lifters in different ways, it may be with higher intensities, it may be with higher volumes, it may be with increased frequency, it may be with different type of progressions or regressions. And as we're training, what we're basing our training off of might be related to our testing and our KPIs. So everything in those other slides or in those other presentations is now leading up to what we're talking about today. So I'm always kind of torn on whether I want to start the program with this type of big picture view, or if I want to get those other discussions in and then have this big picture talk. So today is sort of the big picture talk, kind of tying in several of our previous discussions. And I just want to remind everybody that the goal is to keep the goal the goal. And if you've got a destination, like a goal with an athlete, you can get there different ways. You know, you might be training on free weights or on machines. You might train 3 days a week, 4 days a week. You might skip right to the most complex type of lifts, or you might, take baby steps and progress them along the way. So as long as you're getting athletes better and not hurting them, if you're improving their performance and you're setting them up for success and it matches your philosophy, that's great. But there's lots of great coaches and great exercise scientists who get to the same destination traveling in different ways, if you will. So take everything with a grain of salt and just remember that it's your philosophy, it's your logic, it's your background on how you want to be able to justify what you're taking athletes through. I want to stop for a moment and just, kind of testify or make a confession that I know that I was sort of late to the game in applying structured periodization. So I kind of discovered a pattern in my late teens or early 20s as I was following a really simple sort of bodybuilding-esque routine where I would do a upper body push day. So I would do chest and tries, and then I would do a leg day. So whether it be squats or deadlifts or both and accessories. And then I would do another upper body day with back and buys. And then my fourth day was cardio, or I would just skip the cardio. So I would basically do those similar lifts, those 3 days of lifts, and then possibly some cardio, or a lot of times not the cardio. And I just kept doing those over and over again with similar lifts. I'd go in and see how many times I could bench press 225, and I sort of just repeat very similar lifts just over and over again. And I noticed I was having good lifts, and then around the second or maybe third week of lifting, I was getting hurt or sick, and it kept happening over and over again. And as I look back now, I just roll my eyes at myself as, of course I was. That was really typical, and that I was beating a dead horse. I was doing the same thing over and over and over again, and my body was rejecting it and trying to find a way to tell me to stop. And the funny thing is that 2 to 3 week period where I was constantly getting a tweak of some sort, or an immune system issue, some kind of sickness, that fits right into that general adaptation syndrome. That is sort of just a perfect example of what was going on. And at that point, I hadn't heard of the general adaptation syndrome. Um, I just knew that something kept happening over and over again. And so what I did was I decided that I'm going to train really hard for a couple of weeks, and I'm just going to take a week off. And because I didn't know what else to do, I was just sort of experimenting, and I found that I could train for two weeks, and then by taking a week off, I actually started seeing some results that way, and I wasn't getting injured and I wasn't getting sick. Now, this wasn't optimal because I was missing out on a lot of training time, but it wasn't long after I started experimenting with this is that I started to learn some of the things that we're going to talk about today. I was able to improve my quality of training for myself and my clients and my athletes. So I want you guys to kind of absorb what we're talking about today and sort of avoid that sensation of just beating a dead horse. I want you all to be productive and be optimal with your training and with your programming. We've got quite a few definitions to go through, and let's get started on that. Think about progressive overload. And this is just applying the stimulus and allowing the body to adapt, and applying the stimulus and allowing the body to adapt. And we repeat that over and over again in an intelligent way so that we might improve performance and achieve goals. So I love the story of Milo of Croton. So as a Greek boy, Milo is gifted or comes across a bull calf, and every day Milo has to carry the bull calf from the bottom of a mountain to the top of the mountain where there's a fresh spring water that it can drink so it can be happy and healthy and all that good stuff. And as a boy, the calf is a challenge, but it's doable. And as the calf grows and gets heavier, well, Milo keeps carrying it just every day up the mountain to get that water. And then by the time the bull is fully grown, Milo ends up being a pretty tough character, because of the slow and gradual growth of the bull in the myth or the story. Milo has slowly and gradually grown stronger and healthier and more capable. So that's progressive overload, sort of in a nutshell. And that's what we want to be able to do. With some caveats, there's a little bit more to it. There's times that you need to back off, and there's times you need to change the stimulus. But if you're ever wondering how to help people get in better shape, be looking out for progressive overload. You can't do the same thing over and over again and expect changes. Like I was with my very simplistic training program, I was expecting changes, and all I was really doing was running into a brick wall and getting sick or getting injured. And the same thing for so many people that are always going to the gym and going through their routine and not changing the routine and not challenging themselves, is that they're going to go to the gym and it's going to help prevent them from falling off or getting worse. Well, all they really may do is be maintaining or potentially overtraining. So let's look for ways that we can help clients or athletes or ourselves achieve progressive overload so that we can do more tomorrow than we could do yesterday, that kind of mentality. And always keep in mind this general adaptation syndrome, because we are going to see this pattern just repeat itself over and over again in our training. So alarm phase, that's kind of what happens when we initiate or introduce a stimulus, is that our body's level of arousal or abilities are going to be kind of shocked a little bit. And then we're going to kind of develop some skills. We're going to be able to do a little bit more than we were able to. But if we keep pushing the program or kind of get carried away and stay too long, we're going to leave that resistance phase and we're going to the exhaustion phase. So as exercise scientists, our sweet spot really lies somewhere in here. This is where we want to push people to, and then we want to back off so that we can start the process over again. So instead of starting here and ending here. We want to start here and here, and then we can begin, and then with a little bit of a break or a deload, we can start the process over again, kind of here, and then we would end the next cycle or the next little block like that. So instead of sort of being a one-hit wonder and ending on a low note, being hurt, being sick, I think back to myself as a late teenager in the early 20s, doing the same magazine workout over and over again and running into a lot of trouble. I think about now about how we can intelligently find the right time to back off just a little bit. And instead of falling off, we just recover, and then we can take sort of a stair-stepper approach to that next level of performance. So be thinking about general adaptation syndrome combined with progressive overload. And basically everything that we're going to talk about today is going to sort of fit in with those two theories. And we've seen this before in this program, is the Goldilocks principle. And I'm not even going to doodle on this chart because I think we're so familiar with it. But look at how similar it is to our general adaptation syndrome. It just follows right off of that. And look at that spot up on the top of the green. It's that super compensation. And that's where we want to end. We want to end on a high note when we're training, as opposed to beating that dead horse and getting carried away and sticking around too long on the same program, or pushing and digging too deep and achieving negative adaptation instead of super compensation. Okay, super compensation. So linear periodization, to use the quote we have, is a programming method that gradually increases intensity relative to an athlete's 1 rep max, while simultaneously reducing volume. So essentially what we're doing with linear periodization is we're taking that stair-stepper approach where we are starting with higher volume, lower intensity relative to the 1 rep max. And then as we train, we are going to lower our volume and raise our intensity. And then we would end up there. So this would be possibly like week 1, our base week. Week 2 would be sort of our volume week, and our performance week, week 3, would sort of come up here. And then week 4, we might fall off and do a little bit of a deload or a reload, as some would call it. And as you're pursuing some of this changes in intensity and volume, just keep the Prilepin's chart in mind as well. And that's linear periodization, is just taking, by starting off a little bit lighter, instead of just going, full bore hardcore out of the gate, by starting off a little bit lighter and, coming in and getting some training in that doesn't exhaust you and doesn't leave you, with shaky legs or walking funny, you're sort of setting yourself up for success. So by starting lighter, it gives you more room to improve over the course of a training cycle, the mesocycle, which we'll be talking about shortly. So by starting lighter, we have more room to improve. If we start hardcore and are maxing out on week 1, there's some benefits there, but that doesn't really leave us much room to improve. That's sort of skipping the whole progressive overload and just going to overload. And that unfortunately helps us skip our super compensation and goes right into negative adaptation. So by starting a little bit easier, it gives us a little bit more room to finish on a higher note. But linear periodization is not the only game in town, basically. You also have nonlinear periodization, which, to use our quote here, is generally a periodized workout that's broken down into high intensity, low volume, followed by high volume, lower intensity sections. This can be within the same week or broken down into week blocks. So if we go back to our charts here, whereas our linear periodization followed our sort of simple steps there to eventually creep up into our higher intensities. Nonlinear periodization can have a similar approach, and there's a lot of benefits to it. I'll be speaking on linear periodization quite a bit in this program because it's a little bit simpler and it's also a little bit better for beginning exercise scientists. So once you master linear periodization, it makes shifting into nonlinear periodization much easier. So we'll be sticking in discussing linear periodization. That does not mean it's superior. There's great cases and great arguments for why nonlinear periodization might be superior. But for today and for this whole program, we're essentially talking about linear periodization. So keep in mind the level of intensity that week 1 is at with linear periodization, and week 2 and week 3. And with a nonlinear periodization, we can start over here, and we could shift over here, and then we could end there. And what you see is that we're still taking the same elevations of intensity over a 3-week space. And some of the benefits would be that by not going in a linear path, we're actually reducing our chances of some overtraining issues that come with linear training. So keep in mind that there's lots of options there. There's many ways to skin the cat, as we've said in the past. But that's just something to be thinking about. And I just wanted you all to know that nonlinear is also extremely effective, and there's excellent benefits from that as well. And this basically shows, I also want to point out that both linear and nonlinear sort of end up having a linear path. So remember that volume and intensity are inverted. So as one goes up, the other one comes down. And if our effort in training is occurring along this line here, it's occurring linearly, but we can perform nonlinear training that instead of going sort of on a line graph here, it would look more like a scatter plot, where one day of training is up here, other day of training is up there. And with that scatter plot, when you look at the average, it would sort of fit that linear model. So a lot of nonlinear training is in fact just a form of unconventional linear training when you look at it for longer term and sort of a bigger picture look. Okay, so we've discussed cycles quite a bit in this program, but now we're going to start defining exactly what we mean and just dissect what a cycle might be a little bit more. And for our purposes in this program, a microcycle is typically always going to be a week or of training or a shortened week of training. Not every week of training is the same though. So just like I was as a late teenager and in my early 20s, beating the dead horse and performing the same handful of training sessions over and over again, I was not utilizing the different types of training that will help one avoid overtraining and achieve supercompensation. Coach Ken, from his book, The Strength Coach's Playbook, discusses 7 types of microcycles. And so we're going to go through them just really briefly. Feel free to pause and read through the definitions a little bit more, or do yourself a favor and get your hands on one of these books. It is an excellent resource. So a base microcycle would be sort of the first microcycle in a mesocycle. And we'll talk about mesocycles in a moment, which are really just a collection of microcycles. So with a base, we're exposing the lifter, we're producing the stimulus for maybe the first time. We're not giving them a too hard of a stimulus or a stressor, because we know that a new stimulus causes that alarm reaction from the general adaptation syndrome, and we don't want to shock the body too hard. And if we give them the right amount of stress, the following week, they'll be ready for a load microcycle, which is a little bit more stressful. And this is a higher volume week. And then the third microcycle could be an unload or a deload or a reload, depending on what you want to call it. But this is a recovery week. The fourth type would be a performance cycle or performance microcycle. And in this microcycle, athletes tend to lift heavy with high intensity, but not necessarily a max out. This is still training and not necessarily testing. A competition microcycle would be more like a testing or a competition week. And the sixth would be a variation or alternative microcycle, which may just be a little bit of a random stressor, maybe new exercises, maybe you're playing games instead of doing strict training. And active rest would be one where we are not really building towards anything aside from just getting the body moving and trying to prevent injuries. And these can be combined and recombined in several interesting ways. We'll talk about a couple of patterns, a couple of common patterns in a few slides here. And that mesocycle, for our purposes, a mesocycle is going to be 4 microcycles or just 1 month of training. Now, macrocycle, for our purposes, is going to usually be 1 year. There are arguments that a macrocycle for a college athlete should be on a 4-year cycle because of the 4-year degree that they are often competing in, or that an Olympic athlete should be competing or should be training on a 4-year macro cycle because of the Olympics occurring every 4 years. But for our purposes, let's stick to discussing 12-month or 1-year macro cycles. And again, think back to that saying I've been using over and over again, is that the goal is to keep the goal. So when we're looking at a macro cycle, we're looking at what do we want to achieve in the next year of training? And that trickle-down effect, knowing that big goal, that has a trickle-down effect that tells us how we're going to want to be training basically almost on every single day leading up to that. And as you're developing your training, you have options. You may go with block training, which is lifting in a sort of a narrow window of a style of training, highly focused on one goal. Some block training definitions. I'll be moving past this rather quickly. Pause and read through it if you like. But just keep in mind that although this is very different terminology, it's sort of matching up to our general adaptation syndrome, is that we're presenting a stress to the body, and we're going to raise the challenge along the way, and then we're going to back off so that the body can adapt and grow. Concurrent training is a sort of antithesis to block training, whereas block training is highly focused on a narrow window of a style of training or a purpose of training. Concurrent brings in several factors and goals of training. So there may be different goals in the weight room. There may be a combination of cardiovascular endurance with muscular strength or goals in the weight room. But this is sort of how multifactorial training occurs. And from what we've discussed in the past in this program, this matches up a little bit more with sort of that training wedge where we may start with an Olympic movement in the beginning of the lift and move to a powerlifting movement and training for strength. And then we might move into some accessories and train for hypertrophy or muscular endurance. So with that concurrent training, that sort of labels some of the training we've talked about previously in this program. So turning back to Coach Joe Kinn and some of the things that he's taught in his book, the Coach's Strength Training Playbook, let's take a look at a complete mesocycle. So this is a complete mesocycle, and each of these weeks would be a microcycle. So remember, there's several different kinds of microcycles. We went through some of the definitions earlier. And in this mesocycle, you're looking at 4 different microcycles. And the stress that's being presented, if we're looking at the color-coded, green is our base week, so they're going to feel free to go. It's not going to really hinder them too much. We're introducing some exercises or some stimulus of training. And then week 2, we're going to kick it up a notch and kind of fatigue them just a little bit more because there's going to be so much volume in the weight room. So they're going to kind of go down to a yellow and not really be quite as performance ready. They're not going to be feeling quite as good outside of the weight room. And then that 3rd week, that performance week, we're gonna kind of hit that central nervous system a little bit because we're gonna train heavy. That is our heaviest week out of the 3 weeks. And then that 4th week, we take it easy. That's a deload, a reload, a recovery week, whatever you want to call it. And this is where that training stress is going to kind of drop through the basement a little bit. Hopefully still being beneficial, still being productive. You can work on technique, you can work on teaching, you can introduce new movements and just keep it light, or you can just back off so that their bodies heal and they recover. So this is a complete mesocycle. And it's complete because the 3 training weeks are 3 weeks in a row, but it doesn't always have to be that way. So if we look at an incomplete or performance training cycle, it's the same setup. It's 4 microcycles making up a mesocycle. And in fact, it's the very same 4 weeks as we saw on the previous slide. They've just been recombined. So the first 3 weeks are different. And that 3rd week from the complete cycle is now our 4th week. And honestly, there are some great advantages to both styles of training. For years, I was more reliant on, or I would more often utilize the complete training cycle because it's easier to organize and plan. You train 3 weeks in a row utilizing a very similar program with some differences from 1 week to the next. And then on that 4th week, you're doing a deload or recovery week. And for me, that was easy. That was a good place for me to start. And then later on, I was reminded of the incomplete or performance training cycle. And when I started experimenting with that, I started seeing some great results, not only for myself, but for my athletes as well. And the reason I would sort of attribute that is that the incomplete cycle allows you to get a little bit more aggressive with your load week because it's followed with a deload or reload. And then in your 4th week, you can get aggressive again with your performance. So here you're aggressive with your volume, which will attack your muscles a little bit more. And here you're more aggressive with your intensity, which is going to attack your central nervous system a little bit more. So you're getting 2 big stresses within a single mesocycle with slightly different emphasis of what they're stressing. And when I shifted over to that, I'll tell you, I'm convinced that I like it a little bit more. It's not always appropriate. Sometimes your Sometimes you want to feel that 5th week that's coming up might be a competition week, whether that's in the weight room or out on the field. And so you have different reasons for recombining these weeks and these microcycles in different patterns. And that could be your own personal philosophy, what you like to do, or it may have to do more with what's going on in the real world of these athletes. I would just remind you all that failing to plan is planning to fail. Be thinking about where the weak links are with your athletes, your lifters, your clients, and always remember, what are the goals? One of, if not the biggest issue I see when looking at young or beginning exercise scientist programs is that they start with a goal in mind, and when they start putting pen to paper or they start typing it out, that goal is forgotten about, and they start just utilizing a program that they've used in the past or one that they saw in a magazine or that somebody else put up for a different purpose, and they start maybe utilizing something like that, but it doesn't necessarily feed towards their goal, or they can't really rationalize why that's the best program. So while you're programming, just stop here and there and just think, is this helping achieve a goal, a training goal? So keep your goal in mind, and then be thinking about what training cycle it is, what season is it, and know your population as well. So again, here are some charts that can help keep us on track. So know your population. We don't want to burn out our beginner athletes with an advanced lifters program, and we don't want to shortchange our advanced lifters with a beginner's frequency. And then know your sport schedule. You don't want to be training like it's off season when it's preseason or in season. And so this is really going to help us determine when should we be training for what goals. Now, know your population again as well. I've only had a couple of athletes I can name in 8 years at the collegiate level of training, and in 14 or 15 years of helping people with just their health and fitness, I can only name about 2 individuals that were performing strength training that I would have stopped them if I knew then what I know now. I would have stopped them, and I would have given them other tasks and challenges, because they were just so strong, that they're so off the charts strong, that getting them a little bit stronger probably wasn't really going to help their performance when we could have been working on mobility or speed work instead. So while most of your athletes will fit into the general training goal zone here, also keep in mind that some athletes won't fit there. Some athletes aren't going to need some of these things, but that's pretty rare. And then also be thinking about, with what season it is, think about how frequent you might be training. Again, the amount of stress that's going on outside the weight room plays a big role on what kind of stress you can put in the weight room. And with the exception of powerlifters, weightlifters, and CrossFit athletes, and maybe bodybuilders, remember that the weight room is just here to supplement and boost athletic performance. So we don't want to get too carried away with what we're doing in the weight room to the point that it is detrimental to what our athletes or clients are trying to do outside the weight room. So really, when it comes to programming and periodization, one of the best things that we can do is just take a big step back and look at a calendar and start planning out some of our training. And while we're going to do a little bit of an example of how that might look, keep in mind that your ability to adapt is going to come in handy on a regular basis. So while we might plan for a year of training ahead of time, just know that people get in car accidents, coaches change their minds, they change their practice schedules. Sometimes you might be training and everything's going well. Maybe it has nothing to do with the schedule. Maybe you just see that you have several athletes that are burnt out and you need to make changes yourself. So we're going to make some plans, but just a reminder, always be ready to change those plans. Okay, so let's say a football season has just ended. A collegiate football season has just ended. And your linemen are good, but they need to be bigger, stronger, and faster, or so says their coach. So if your season has just ended in November or early December, you can sort of look at the next 8 months, and it's essentially going to look like this. You'll have a postseason, an off-season, and a preseason over 8 months. And so now we're starting to get a little bit clearer idea of what to do and when to do it. Because remember, with those blue charts we just looked at, that gives us a little bit of an insight as to what we might want to be doing in those different seasons. Such as lifts per week. That postseason, 0 to 3 lifts a week. Off-season has our highest volume or frequency of lifts. And then preseason, we usually drop it down. And if you're getting 3 to 4 lifts in preseason, that's pretty good. A lot of times it'll be more like 2 because your athletes are so busy getting like 2-day practices in and a high volume of stress and challenge out of the weight room. So 3 to 4 is pretty generous for preseason. And then again, using the charts that we've gone over, we know sort of the linear approach and what you might want to do to grow your abilities in a linear fashion would be to go ahead and develop some muscular hypertrophy and muscular endurance. And then you're going to feed off of that for growing strength and power. And then as you get into preseason, you change that priority from strength and power to being sport specific. So that way they can take all that new muscle they have and new strength and power that they have, and they can help dial it in and boost sport performance, not just weight room performance. So using our same chart here. So now we know our macro cycle goals. And our macro cycle goal was to get bigger, faster, stronger. But now, because of sort of doing the layout, we now know our mesocycle goals. So each of the 8 months, we now know what we're striving for in each of those 8 months. And playing off of that, now we can determine our microcycle goals. And just a reminder, we're not going to read through them, but your microcycles are going to fall typically into one of these 7 categories. So now, let's take a look here. So now, and this would be sort of like a variety of training. In that postseason, it's 0 to 3 lifts per week. We're not looking to be specific, and so we're going to allow them for a variety. So if they want to go out and play, do more bowling or swimming, or if they're feeling good, if they want to be doing some more basketball or something like that, that's a good time for them to not be football players. That's a good time for their minds and their bodies to go do something different. Or if they've got finals in that first week, maybe they lay off of physical activity and they just study like crazy and take care of the stress that comes from the classroom. And then moving on, we might do a base volume performance week followed by a deload. So, low, medium, and high stressors followed by a almost non-existent stressor. And that's a complete mesocycle. And then for our next mesocycle, we might go base, volume, and then we might go deload, and then performance. And that was an incomplete or performance mesocycle. Incomplete or performance mesocycle. And then we go base, volume, performance, deload. And we go base, volume, deload, performance, and base, volume, performance, deload. For whatever reasons, there might be something along the schedule, or maybe you're experimenting. So I'm not going to tie any rationale or not going to go too depth into why you might be doing these things, but base, volume, deload, performance, base, off, performance, deload. So on that off week, why is that an off week? Well, that's July 4th. And a lot of times you're going to get holiday break right there. So now we failed to put a spring break in there, but you're probably going to have spring break somewhere in here. But yeah, so these are things that you need to take into account, and you can utilize a week off, and you can call that a deload week and just pick up training as if nothing happened when they come back. Or you might do a performance week ahead of time and then give them a base week when they come back. This is going to sort of just depend on your philosophy and what you think is right. And then in August, maybe we've got a volume deload, performance deload. Well, why do we have two deloads right here? Well, keep in mind that this is probably going to be training camp or just before training camp. So you're probably gonna have extra deloads here. Just something to keep in mind. So these are just some of the other factors, whether it's spring break or 4th of July week or that preseason is starting. So now we have successfully taken our macro cycle goal, which was to take our football linemen and make them bigger, faster, and stronger. And now we sort of know what they're going to be doing for the next, 8 times 4 is 32. So now we kind of know what they're going to be doing for about the next 32 weeks. And what you would do then is those weeks, you know how many lifts they're doing per week. So if they end up doing, we won't program there. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Let's say there's 5 lifts a week there. So that might be 35. And then for those 4 weeks, let's say there's 3, so that's 12. So what's 35 plus 12 is 47. So now the football season might have just ended, but you might know what these players are going to do for the next 47 workouts that are structured and organized. So that big scary year that was coming up ahead of you, now you got it boiled down to 47 lifts. And when you start talking like that, it doesn't seem like much. And those 47 lifts all have their place in the system of challenging and recovery. And so this allows for progressive overload and for intelligent design and having a rational and logical approach to, almost an entire year of training. And that's what we've got for programming and periodization. And again, these are just some thoughts and theories with a little bit of science and a little bit of experience. But I hope that you are all kind of growing your philosophy and starting to understand a little bit more about why you might do the type of training that you're doing, or why you might not do some of the things that I'm talking about. So anything in between, and as long as you guys are growing and learning, that's my biggest goal. Great. Thanks, guys. Good work.